Somewhere in the cotton fields of rural Alabama, a man walked among his enemies wearing their white robes. For 18 months he attended their midnight gatherings, spoke their hateful words, and learned their darkest secrets. His hands had shaken the very hands that murdered his father. The Klansmen called him Brother. They never suspected that the quiet, light-skinned man beneath the hood was born into slavery on the same plantation they now terrorized. His name was recorded in only 3 places: a slave registry from 1852, a land deed from 1883, and a coroner's report from 1885 that authorities sealed for 47 years. What happened in Lowndes County between August 1884 and March 1885 was never officially investigated. Though 7 prominent white men died under circumstances the local newspaper described only as unfortunate accidents of unusual similarity. Before we continue with the story of how one man turned the Klan's own hatred against itself, I need you to do something for me. If you're listening to this from the American South, or if your family has roots in these dark chapters of our history, leave a comment telling me what state you're from. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one, stories they tried to bury, need to be told. Now let me take you back to a place where justice wore a mask, and revenge was patient. The story begins not in 1884, but 32 years earlier, on the Gaines plantation outside Hayneville, Alabama. Thomas Gaines owned 4,000 acres of prime cotton land and 93 enslaved people. Among them was a woman named Ruth, house servant to the Gaines family, who bore a son in the spring of 1852. The child's father was never recorded in any official document, but everyone on the plantation knew. The boy had his mother's dark eyes, but skin several shades lighter than hers, and features that caused uncomfortable silence when the master's brother visited from Montgomery. They named him Samuel Vance, taking his mother's surname from the previous owner who'd sold her south. Samuel grew up in that peculiar purgatory of the plantation system. Too light to be fully trusted by the other enslaved people, too black to ever be acknowledged by the white family whose blood he might carry. His mother taught him to read in secret, using a worn Bible she'd hidden beneath the floorboards of the kitchen house. By the time he was 10, Samuel could read better than most white children in Lowndes County. By 12, he understood that this knowledge could get him killed. The Civil War came to Alabama like a fever, and Samuel was 14 when Union troops finally reached Hayneville in April 1865. His mother had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia. Samuel stood among the other freed people, listening to a Yankee officer read the Emancipation Proclamation, and felt nothing. Freedom was just a word. He had nowhere to go, no family except ghosts, and no skills beyond picking cotton and reading books he wasn't supposed to touch. He stayed on the Gaines place, working as a paid laborer now, though the coins barely bought food. Thomas Gaines had lost 3 sons to the war and most of his wealth to Union confiscation. The plantation limped along, a shadow of its former self, while resentment grew thick as kudzu in the Alabama heat. By 1870, Samuel had saved enough to rent a small plot of land 5 miles from the Gaines plantation. He was 18 years old, could read and write, and had started attending the colored church in Hayneville, where a freedman named Moses taught farming techniques and basic arithmetic. Samuel kept his head down, worked his land, and avoided trouble. He understood that freedom in Alabama was conditional, provisional, and could be revoked with a rope. He married in 1873, a woman named Clara from the neighboring county, herself born into slavery, who'd learned midwifery from her grandmother. They had a daughter in 1874, tiny and perfect, who died before her first birthday from the flux. They had a son in 1876 who lived. They named him Daniel. Samuel's father, the white man whose features Samuel saw in his own face every time he passed a mirror, died in 1878 without ever acknowledging him. Samuel felt nothing at that funeral, watching from a distance as Hayneville's white society mourned a man who'd never spoken his name. By 1880, Samuel owned his land outright. 23 acres of exhausted cotton field and pine forest, but it was his. He'd registered the deed in Montgomery, paid every dollar honestly, and had the papers to prove it. In a county where most freedmen still sharecropped, trapped in cycles of debt and dependency, Samuel Vance had something that terrified certain white men more than any army: autonomy. The Ku Klux Klan had been active in Alabama since 1866, though it had supposedly disbanded after federal intervention in the early 1870s. But in Lowndes County, they'd never truly left. They'd just stopped wearing the hoods for a while. By 1883, with Reconstruction officially dead and federal troops long gone, the Night Riders had returned. They called themselves the White League now, or sometimes just concerned citizens. But everyone knew what the white robes meant when they appeared in the darkness. Samuel heard the stories at church. Freedmen beaten for insolence. A man named Josiah burned out of his home for trying to vote. A woman named Esther run out of the county for teaching colored children to read. The violence was specific, targeted, designed to maintain order. The old order, where white men held all power and black people knew their place. Samuel kept quiet. He worked his land, raised his son, and stayed away from politics. He didn't attend the political meetings where freedmen talked about their rights. He didn't register to vote, though technically he could. He made himself small, invisible, hoping that invisibility would keep him safe. It didn't. July 17, 1884. A Wednesday night so humid the air felt like breathing through wet cloth. Samuel was working late, burning brush in the back section of his property, when he saw the glow on the horizon. Not the orange of sunset. Sunset had been hours ago, but the angry red of fire. He ran toward his house, his boots pounding the hard-packed earth, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin was intact. Clara stood in the doorway, Daniel pressed against her side, both of them staring toward the road. The fire was coming from the direction of town, from the crossroads where the colored church stood. By the time Samuel reached the church, it was already half collapsed. Flames climbed into the night sky, sending up sparks that looked like angry stars. 24 people stood watching, all black, all silent, all knowing exactly what this meant. Moses, the teacher who'd helped Samuel learn to farm, lay in the road in front of the burning building. His clothes were torn, his face was a mass of bruises, he was still breathing, barely. They said he was teaching insurrection. Someone whispered, teaching colored people to think they were equal. Samuel knelt beside Moses, who opened his eyes. "Samuel," he breathed, "they're coming for everyone who can read, everyone who owns land, everyone who won't bow down." His hand gripped Samuel's arm with surprising strength. "They're coming for you." Moses died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The church was ruled an accidental fire. The sheriff, a man named Tucker, who'd been an overseer before the war, didn't investigate. Samuel buried Moses with the other freedmen in the colored section of the cemetery and tried to return to normal life. But normal had ended. He felt eyes on him constantly. White men he'd known for years stopped speaking to him. At the general store in Hayneville, the clerk told him his credit was no good anymore. "Nothing personal," the clerk said, not meeting Samuel's eyes. "Just can't extend credit to niggers who don't know their place." Samuel paid in cash and left. His hands didn't shake until he was back on his own land. 3 weeks later, on August 9, 1884, they came for him. Samuel was working in the field when Clara screamed. He dropped his hoe and ran toward the house, but he was too late. They were already there, 6 men on horseback, wearing white hoods and robes. One of them held Daniel, his hand clamped over the boy's mouth. Daniel was 8 years old. His eyes were huge with terror. "Samuel Vance," one of the riders said. His voice was educated, cultured, completely calm. "You've been judged by the White League of Lowndes County. You own land that should belong to white men. You read books above your station. Your very existence is an insult to the natural order." Samuel raised his hands, palms out. "Please, I've done nothing wrong. I work my land. I don't cause trouble." "That's exactly the problem," another rider said. You think you have the right to land, to dignity, to stand upright instead of bowing. He leaned forward in his saddle. We're going to teach you the error of your ways. They made Samuel watch as they burned his crops. They made Clara and Daniel watch as they dragged Samuel into the woods. They tied his hands to a low branch, stripped off his shirt, and took turns with a whip that had nails embedded in the leather. Samuel didn't scream. He bit through his lip, tasted blood, and didn't give them the satisfaction. Next time, the educated voice said, "We'll kill you. Sell your land and leave Lowndes County, or we'll string you up like we did that teacher." They left him hanging from the tree. Clara found him 2 hours later, cut him down, and spent the night picking splinters of metal from his back. But Samuel didn't leave. He couldn't. This was his land, bought with honest money, registered in Montgomery. If he ran, he lost everything. If he stayed, they'd kill him. There was no good choice, so Samuel made a different choice. He decided to destroy them from the inside. The plan came to Samuel in pieces, over weeks of healing, while Clara cleaned his wounds and Daniel asked questions about why bad men hurt people. The clan operated in secrecy because secrecy gave them power. They could be anyone: the shopkeeper who sold you flour, the banker who held your mortgage, the sheriff who refused to investigate their crimes. They hid behind hoods, behind darkness, behind the protection of white solidarity. But Samuel had an advantage none of them suspected. He could pass. Not completely, not in daylight, not under scrutiny. But his light skin, his educated speech, his ability to read and write, these things set him apart. More than that, he understood how white men thought. He'd grown up among them, studied them, learned to anticipate their moods and needs and prejudices. He'd survived slavery by making himself useful, unthreatening, almost invisible. Now he would use those same skills to become something else. The first step was research. Samuel spent 2 weeks in Montgomery, using money he'd hidden from the Klansmen, reading everything he could find about the Ku Klux Klan in the state library. He learned their rituals, their ranks, their secret handshakes and passwords. He learned that local chapters, called klaverns, operated with significant independence. He learned that the Klan was always recruiting, always looking for white men who shared their hatred. The second step was transformation. Samuel returned to his cabin with a plan that terrified Clara, but which he understood was their only hope. He would become someone else, someone white. "It won't work," Clara said. "They'll know. They'll know if they look closely," Samuel agreed. "But they won't look closely. They see what they expect to see. A light-skinned man with education and anger toward Negroes. They'll see a white man. A poor white man, maybe. Someone whose blood isn't as pure as they'd like, but white enough." He needed a new identity, a history that would hold up under casual questioning but which couldn't be easily verified. He decided to become Simon Vance, keeping his surname, explaining it as coincidence if anyone asked, a white man from North Carolina who'd come to Alabama looking for opportunity after losing his farm to carpetbaggers. The third step was the hardest. Samuel had to find a way into the Klan. He started spending time in Hayneville, in the places where white men gathered. The saloon on Main Street, the tobacco shop, the courthouse steps. He dressed in worn but clean clothes, spoke with a slight Carolina accent he'd practiced until it sounded natural, and most importantly, he listened. White men, Samuel learned, loved to talk. They bragged about their superiority, their God-given right to rule, their plans for keeping the Negro in his place. Samuel nodded along, said little, and waited for his opportunity. It came in late September at the saloon when a man named William Hutchins started complaining about the uppity niggers who thought they could own land. "There's one out past my place," Hutchins said. "Samuel something. Got 20 acres and acts like he's white. Someone should teach him a lesson." Samuel, playing the role of Simon, spoke carefully. "I knew a nigger like that back in Carolina. Thought he was equal. We taught him different." The conversation stopped. Every white man at the bar turned to look at him. "What did you do?" Hutchins asked. Samuel smiled, though it made his stomach turn. "We reminded him of his place. With a rope. The men laughed. They bought him a drink. And just like that, Simon Vance was welcomed into their circle. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel learned more about the Lowndes County Klan than he'd ever wanted to know. They met every other Wednesday at midnight in a clearing in the woods 5 miles from town. The current Exalted Cyclops, their leader, was Richard Pemberton, who owned the largest plantation in the county. The other members included Hutchins, Sheriff Tucker, the bank president James Hartford, a merchant named Douglas Fairweather, a doctor named Charles Wortham, and about 15 others. They were planning something. Samuel could feel it in the way they talked, the looks they exchanged, the sudden silences when he entered a room. On October 7th, Hutchins approached him at the saloon. "Simon," he said quietly, "some of us have noticed you're a man of conviction, a man who understands the natural order. We could use men like you." Samuel pretended to hesitate. "Use me how? There's an organization, good Christian men who protect white civilization from the Negro threat. We meet Wednesday night. I could bring you if you're interested." Samuel let himself look honored. "I'd be proud to join. One condition," Hutchins said. "You'll take an oath, you'll swear loyalty, and you'll prove that loyalty when we call on you." "I understand." Hutchins studied him for a long moment. Samuel kept his face carefully neutral, his breathing steady. Finally, Hutchins nodded. "Wednesday midnight. Meet me at the crossroads south of town. Don't be late." Samuel went home that night and held his son. Daniel was almost 9 now, old enough to understand that his father was doing something dangerous. "Will you come back?" Daniel asked. Samuel thought about lying, but didn't. "I don't know. But if I don't, your mother will take you north. You'll have the land to sell, the money to start fresh. You'll have a chance I never had." "I want you to come back," Daniel said. "I'll try," Samuel promised. "I'll try my very best." Wednesday came too quickly and not quickly enough. Samuel kissed Clara goodbye, memorized the feel of his son's hand in his, and rode to the crossroads. Hutchins was waiting, along with 2 other men Samuel recognized from the saloon. They rode in silence through the pine forest, following paths Samuel had walked as a child. When they reached the clearing, 40 men in white robes were already waiting. Someone handed Samuel a robe and hood. He put them on with hands that wanted to shake, forcing himself to stay calm. Beneath the hood, he could finally let his face show what he felt. The rage, the terror, the overwhelming sense of being surrounded by his father's murderers, because that was what they were. Samuel didn't know which specific hands had held the rope that killed Moses, but it didn't matter. They were all guilty. They had all chosen hatred. They would all pay. The initiation ceremony was designed to bind men together through shared ritual and shared sin. Samuel stood among the white-robed figures, listening to Richard Pemberton speak about purity and blood and the sacred duty of white men to maintain order. They made him swear oaths on a Bible while kneeling before a burning cross. They called him brother. They welcomed him into their secret brotherhood. Samuel spoke the words they wanted, made the gestures they required, and memorized every face he could see in the firelight. Some men kept their hoods on even during the ceremony, but others grew careless. He recognized the banker, the doctor, the man who ran the general store, the deputy sheriff, even the minister of the White Baptist Church. After the ceremony, they discussed business. There were 3 Negroes in the county who needed correction. One had been asking about voting rights. Another had spoken back to a white man. The third, Samuel's heart went cold, was a woman named Esther, who'd been teaching colored children to read. "We'll handle the men," Pemberton said. "But the woman, she's trickier. She has white sympathizers. Yankees who send her money for her school. Burn the school," someone suggested. "Too obvious," Pemberton replied. "It needs to look like an accident. Or better yet, we need evidence she's been stealing from those Yankees. Get her arrested legally, and the school closes without us having to lift a finger." They were planning to frame her. Plant evidence, forge documents, use the law itself as a weapon. Samuel listened, his hands clenched beneath the white robe, and said nothing. The meeting ended near dawn. The men dispersed in different directions, removing their robes and becoming ordinary citizens again. Samuel rode home as the sun rose, his mind racing. He'd infiltrated the clan. He knew their secrets, their plans, their membership. But what could he do with that knowledge? He was one man, black in a country that had made it clear black lives didn't matter, and he'd just sworn oaths to the very organization that wanted him dead. Clara was waiting when he arrived home. She took one look at his face and knew. "You did it," she whispered. "I did it." Samuel dismounted slowly, every muscle aching with tension. Now I need to figure out how to destroy them without destroying myself. The solution came to him 3 days later, while he was working in his field and thinking about the teacher Esther. The clan's power came from secrecy and impunity. They could do whatever they wanted because no one could prove they'd done it, and even if someone could, the law wouldn't care. But what if the clan members turned on each other? What if Samuel could make them suspect one another, destroy their trust from within, turn their paranoia, the same paranoia that made them hate black people, against themselves? It would require patience. It would require careful planning. Most importantly, it would require that Samuel become someone even more dangerous than Simon Vance, the North Carolina racist. He would become their confidant, their friend, their trusted brother in hatred, and then he would tear them apart. The first step was to establish himself as loyal. At the next meeting, in late October, Samuel volunteered for a mission. 3 Klansmen were supposed to ride out to intimidate the Negro who'd asked about voting. Samuel said he wanted to prove himself. Pemberton looked at him thoughtfully. "You understand what we do?" "I understand justice," Samuel said carefully. "White justice." They let him come. Samuel rode with Hutchins and 2 others to a small farm where a man named Abraham lived with his wife and 3 children. They surrounded the house at midnight, fired shots into the air, and shouted threats until Abraham came out with his hands raised. "I don't want trouble," Abraham said. His voice was steady despite the guns pointed at him. "Then stop trying to vote," Hutchins said. "Niggers don't vote in Lowndes County." Abraham nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." They left him there, trembling but alive, and Samuel felt sick. He'd just participated in terrorizing an innocent man. He'd worn the hood, ridden with them, said nothing. For the sake of his plan, he'd become complicit in their evil. That night, after the others had gone home, Samuel returned to Abraham's farm. He knocked softly on the door and waited until Abraham answered, holding an old shotgun. "It's Samuel," he whispered. "Samuel Vance, Ruth's son from the Gaines place." Abraham's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" "I was one of the riders tonight, but I'm not one of them. I'm trying to destroy them from inside." Samuel spoke quickly, aware of every second passing. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to do exactly what they said. Don't try to vote. Don't give them any reason to come back. Not yet. Why should I believe you? Because if I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already." Samuel met his eyes. "I'm going to burn them down, but it takes time. Can you give me time?" Abraham studied him for a long moment, then lowered the gun. "How much time?" "Months, maybe longer. But when I'm done, they won't be able to hurt you or anyone else ever again." Abraham nodded slowly. "Then I'll wait. But Samuel, don't take too long. We're dying out here." Samuel went to 3 more clan meetings before he made his first move. He learned their patterns, their personalities, their conflicts. He learned that Hutchins and Fairweather hated each other over a land dispute. He learned that Sheriff Tucker owed money to banker Hartford. He learned that Dr. Wortham had been accused of inappropriate behavior with a patient, a white patient, and the clan had helped cover it up. Every organization has fractures. The clan was no different. Samuel just needed to find those fractures and widen them. He started with Hutchins. At the saloon one afternoon, Samuel mentioned casually that he'd heard Fairweather bragging about being Pemberton's right-hand man. "Fairweather?" Hutchins snorted. "That fool. He's barely fit to wear the robe." "That's what I thought," Samuel agreed. but he was saying he might be the next exalted Cyclops. Said Pemberton promised him. It was a lie, but Hutchins believed it. Samuel could see the anger building behind his eyes. The next Klan meeting was tense, with Hutchins openly challenging Fairweather's suggestions and Pemberton snapping at both of them to maintain order. Samuel planted similar seeds with others. He told the deputy that Sheriff Tucker was planning to expose certain members to federal authorities. He told Hartford that Wortham had been spreading rumors about the bank's solvency. Each lie was small, plausible, designed to create doubt and suspicion. By December, the Klan meetings had become uncomfortable. Men who'd been brothers in bigotry now eyed each other warily. Arguments broke out. Trust eroded. But it wasn't enough. They were suspicious, but they weren't turning on each other. Not yet. Samuel needed something bigger. He needed proof of betrayal, and he needed someone to take the fall. Just when Samuel thought his patience would never be rewarded, the Klan handed him the perfect opportunity. In early January 1885, Pemberton announced that someone had been stealing from the Klavan's treasury. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Nearly $200 had gone missing over the past 3 months. "There's a thief among us," Pemberton said, his voice cold with fury. "A brother who's violated his sacred oath." The men shifted uneasily beneath their hoods. Everyone suspected everyone else. The paranoia Samuel had been carefully cultivating suddenly had a focus. Pemberton appointed Sheriff Tucker to investigate. It was, Samuel realized immediately, the perfect opportunity. Tucker was competent but lazy, the kind of man who'd accept the most obvious answer rather than dig deeper. All Samuel needed to do was point Tucker in the right direction. He chose Douglas Fairweather as his target. Fairweather was wealthy enough that stealing seemed unlikely, which would make the evidence more shocking. He was also arrogant, which meant he'd likely handled the Klavan's money at some point and left traces. Samuel broke into Fairweather's store one night in mid-January, using skills he'd learned as a child, when sneaking into the plantation house to steal food. He found Fairweather's personal ledger and, using careful forgery techniques, created entries showing money moving from the Klavan treasury to Fairweather's personal accounts. He made the forgeries obvious enough to be discovered, but subtle enough to seem like Fairweather had tried to hide them. Then he planted a bag containing $50 in Confederate currency, worthless now, but the right denomination to match the Klavan's missing funds, in Fairweather's storage room. Finally, he mentioned to Tucker casually that he'd seen Fairweather counting a large amount of money at the last meeting. "Seemed odd," Samuel said. "We'd just collected dues, but Fairweather was counting way more than his share." Tucker's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that?" "I know what I saw." Tucker investigated. He found the ledger. He found the money. He confronted Fairweather at the next Klan meeting, with 40 men watching. Fairweather denied everything. "This is ridiculous. I've never stolen anything in my life." "The evidence says different," Tucker said. "Then someone planted it." Fairweather looked around wildly. "Someone's trying to frame me." But that only made him look more guilty. The more he protested, the more the other men pulled away. Pemberton's face was stone. "You've violated your oath," Pemberton said quietly. "You've betrayed your brothers. The punishment for theft is expulsion and—" He didn't finish, but everyone understood. They took Fairweather into the woods. Samuel was forced to watch, his stomach churning, as they beat him unconscious. They didn't kill him. That would have drawn too much attention, but they made sure he'd never walk properly again. Then they dumped him on the road 3 miles from town. Fairweather survived. Barely. He left Alabama 2 weeks later, broken in body and spirit, never knowing who'd actually stolen the money or why he'd been chosen as the scapegoat. Samuel felt no satisfaction. He'd just destroyed an innocent man, or at least innocent of theft, if not of the greater crime of Klan membership. But the plan was working. The Klansmen were turning on each other. Trust was dead. Now Samuel moved to Phase 2. He waited 3 weeks, letting the tension simmer. Then, in late February, he approached Hutchins privately. "I need to tell you something," Samuel said, his voice low and urgent. "But you have to swear you won't repeat it." Hutchins leaned in, curious. What is it? I think Pemberton might have been the one who set up Fairweather. Hutchins' eyes widened. What? Why would he do that? Think about it, Samuel said. Pemberton controls the Treasury. He's the only one who could have stolen the money without being noticed. But he needed someone to blame. Fairweather was convenient, wealthy enough to seem like he didn't need the money, which made the theft more shocking. Arrogant enough that people would believe he thought he could get away with it. Hutchins shook his head. That's a serious accusation. I know. That's why I'm only telling you, but watch Pemberton, watch how he acts, and ask yourself, who really benefited from Fairweather being expelled? Samuel planted similar doubts with 3 other Klansmen. Each conversation was private, each accusation slightly different, but all pointing toward Pemberton. He was careful never to push too hard, never to insist. He simply raised questions and let paranoia do the rest. The March meeting was explosive. Someone, Samuel never found out who, directly accused Pemberton of being the real thief. Pemberton denied it furiously, but the damage was done. The Klansmen split into factions, those loyal to Pemberton, those who believed the accusations, and those who simply didn't know what to believe. Samuel watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. The Klan was eating itself alive. But he wasn't done yet. The final move had to be public, it had to be undeniable, and it had to destroy any chance of the Klan recovering. On March 14, 1885, Samuel gathered information about every Klan member, their names, addresses, crimes they'd committed, people they'd hurt. He'd been collecting this information for months, memorizing details, writing nothing down that could be discovered. Then he sent an anonymous letter to the Mobile Register, Alabama's most prominent newspaper. The letter detailed the Lowndes County Klan's activities, named specific members, and provided enough detail to be credible. He mailed it from Montgomery, using careful handwriting that couldn't be traced to him. He sent a second letter to the federal marshal in Montgomery, with the same information. Reconstruction might be over, but federal authorities still had the power to investigate if they chose to. And then Samuel waited. The Register published the exposé on March 21, 1885. The headline read, "Secret Society of Terror, the Ku Klux Klan's reign in Lowndes County exposed." Samuel bought a copy at the general store in Hayneville, paying his nickel to the same clerk who'd refused him credit 6 months earlier. The clerk's hands trembled as he took the coin. Everyone in town had read the article by then. Everyone knew names had been named. Samuel carried the newspaper back to his cabin and read it on his porch while Daniel played in the yard. Clara stood in the doorway, watching the road, one hand resting on the shotgun they now kept loaded by the door. The article was devastating in its detail. It described meetings Samuel had attended, conversations he'd memorized, crimes he'd witnessed. It named Richard Pemberton as the exalted Cyclops. It identified Sheriff Tucker, banker James Hartford, merchant Douglas Fairweather, though he'd already fled the county, and 12 others. Some names were redacted as prominent citizens whose identities are known to this newspaper but withheld pending investigation, which only increased the paranoia. The reporter had done his job well, Samuel thought. He'd taken Samuel's anonymous letter and expanded it with additional research, interviewing black residents who'd been terrorized, examining public records for patterns of violence, connecting dots that authorities had deliberately ignored for years. The article didn't just expose the Klan, it indicted the entire system that had protected them. By noon, 3 families had already packed their wagons and left town. By sunset, federal marshals were riding into Hayneville. Samuel watched them arrive from his field, 6 men on horseback, led by a marshal named William Crawford, who'd made his reputation prosecuting Klan violence during Reconstruction. Crawford was older now, his beard gone gray, but his eyes still held the cold determination of a man who believed in law, even when law was unpopular. The arrests began that night. Hartford was taken from his home in handcuffs while his wife screamed about injustice. Tucker was removed from the sheriff's office, his badge stripped away, his protests ignored. 2 others, Men Samuel recognized from multiple midnight rides were arrested at their farms, their families watching in shocked silence. But Pemberton remained free. His lawyer, a man named Silas Thornton, who'd defended plantation owners against federal prosecution for 20 years, had him protected behind a wall of legal maneuvers and influential connections. Pemberton stayed in his mansion, receiving visitors, plotting his defense, and, Samuel knew from his remaining contacts, planning revenge. The remaining Klan members went to ground. Some claimed they'd only attended a few meetings, knew nothing about violence, had been pressured to join. Others insisted the whole thing was a northern conspiracy, carpetbagger lies designed to humiliate the South. A few, sensing which way the wind was blowing, quietly provided information to the marshals in exchange for immunity. The black community of Lowndes County watched all of this with cautious hope mixed with deep skepticism. They'd seen promises before. They'd seen arrests before. They knew how these things usually ended, with white men walking free and black people paying the price for daring to seek justice. Samuel shared their skepticism. He knew the arrests were just the beginning. Real justice, the kind that actually changed things, required more than putting 4 men in cells while dozens of others remained free. It required fear. It required consequences that couldn't be appealed or negotiated away. It required the kind of justice Samuel had been planning since the moment he took off that white hood and revealed his face. The Clavins' final meeting happened 3 days after the arrests, on March 24th. Only 8 men showed up, meeting in daylight in an abandoned tobacco barn because they no longer trusted the darkness. Samuel arrived as Simon Vance one last time, his light skin and perfect accent getting him past the nervous guards they'd posted. Inside, the men looked haunted. Pemberton stood at the center trying to maintain authority, but his voice carried a desperate edge Samuel had never heard before. "We've been betrayed," Pemberton said. "Someone among us talked to that newspaper. Someone violated their oath. We need to identify them before they destroy us completely." Samuel let them talk, let them accuse each other, let the paranoia he'd carefully cultivated reach its peak. Then, when Hutchins directly asked if anyone knew who the traitor was, Samuel spoke. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice carrying across the barn. "And I realized something important. Whoever wrote that letter knew details only a member would know. Specific dates, specific conversations, the exact number of men at certain meetings." The men shifted uncomfortably, each one remembering moments that had been described in the newspaper with uncomfortable accuracy. "But here's what I can't figure out," Samuel continued, walking slowly toward the center of the barn. "Why would a real member betray us? What would they gain? Unless—" He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Unless they were never really one of us to begin with." Pemberton's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting, Vance?" Samuel reached up and removed his hat. Then, slowly, he unbuttoned his collar, revealing the scars on his neck, the marks where a whip had cut into his skin 6 months earlier, marks that had healed but would never fully disappear. "I'm suggesting," he said quietly, "that you're all fools." The comprehension came slowly, spreading through the barn like spilled oil. Hutchins stepped back, his hand moving toward his gun. 2 others did the same, but Samuel was faster. The pistol appeared in his hand as if conjured, already cocked, already aimed at Pemberton's chest. "My name," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart, "is Samuel Vance. My mother was Ruth, enslaved on the Gaines plantation. My father was probably one of your friends, one of your families, one of the upstanding white men of this county who thought he could use a black woman's body without consequences. I was born into slavery. I learned to read in secret. I survived the war. I bought land with honest money, and when you came to my home and whipped me in front of my wife and son, I decided to destroy you." The barn was completely silent. Samuel could hear his own breathing, could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool March air. "For 6 months, he continued, I wore your hood. I spoke your words. I learned your secrets. I memorized every name, every crime, every weakness. You never suspected. You saw what you wanted to see, a white man who hated niggers, and you never looked closer. You never asked where I came from. You never questioned my story. Your own racism made you blind. Pemberton's face had gone pale. You're lying. You can't be what? Black? Samuel laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Look at me, Pemberton. Really look at me. See the features I inherited from whichever white man raped my mother? See how those same features let me walk among you, pretending to be one of you? Your precious white blood mixed with black blood, creating someone who could destroy you from within. Hutchins raised his gun. Samuel turned his own weapon toward him without hesitation. Don't, Samuel said. The federal marshals are in town. You kill me, you hang. Simple as that. You're not above the law anymore. The whole country is watching Lowndes County now. You touch me, you prove everything that newspaper said about you. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hutchins slowly lowered his gun, his face twisted with impotent rage. You think you've won, Pemberton said quietly. You think you're safe. But there are dozens of us, hundreds across Alabama, thousands across the South. You're one man, one nigger who got lucky. We'll come for you eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but we have long memories. Samuel met his eyes steadily. So do I, and I've spent 6 months learning everything about you. Where you live, where you go, who you love, what you fear. You want to come for me? Go ahead, but understand this. I know your patterns now. I know your routines. I know which of you drinks too much. Which of you rides alone at night? Which of you has enemies who'd love an excuse to settle old scores? He paused, letting that sink in. You taught me that power is everything, that mercy is weakness, that the strong survive by destroying the weak. I was an excellent student, better than you ever expected. Samuel backed toward the door, his gun still trained on the group. The Clavern is finished. The law is watching you now. Your neighbors know what you are. Your own families are ashamed of you. You have nothing left except your hatred, and hatred won't protect you from what's coming. He reached the door, stepped through it, and walked away from the barn. Behind him he heard raised voices, arguments, the sound of men turning on each other. He didn't look back. That night, Samuel sat on his porch with the loaded shotgun across his lap, watching the road. Clara brought him coffee at midnight, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. It's done, he said. No, she replied, it's just beginning. She was right. The exposure had destroyed the Clavern as an organization, but individual Klansmen remained dangerous. They had weapons, anger, and nothing left to lose. Samuel knew they'd come for him eventually. The only question was when and how many would die in the process. The first attempt came 3 days later. Samuel was working in his field when he saw dust rising from the road, 3 riders approaching fast. He recognized Hutchins in the lead, flanked by 2 men whose names he'd learned during his time in the Klan. They weren't wearing hoods now. They didn't need to. This was personal. Samuel had prepared for this moment. He'd spent the last 3 days setting traps around his property, studying approaches, planning escape routes. When the riders turned onto his land, Samuel was already moving, already executing the plan he'd rehearsed a dozen times. He fired 1 shot from the tree line, deliberately missing just to get their attention. The riders scattered, taking cover, shouting to each other. Samuel used their confusion to circle around, getting between them and their horses. The horses, spooked by gunfire and by the firecrackers Samuel had rigged to explode under their hooves, bolted. The 3 men found themselves on foot, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain, facing an enemy who knew every tree, every gully, every hiding place. Samuel didn't try to kill them. Not here. Not like this. Instead, he herded them like cattle, firing shots that came close but never quite hit, driving them deeper into the pine forest, farther from help. He kept them moving until sunset, until they were exhausted and disoriented and terrified. Then, as darkness fell, he disappeared, simply vanished into the forest, leaving them to find their way back to town on foot, humiliated and defeated. They reached Hayneville near dawn, their clothes torn, their pride shattered. They told everyone who'd listened that Samuel Vance had tried to murder them. Marshal Crawford investigated, questioned Samuel, and concluded that 3 white men who'd recently been exposed as Klan members had trespassed on a black man's property and been driven off. No charges were filed, but Samuel knew it wasn't over. Hutchins had tasted humiliation. That was more dangerous than simple hatred. The second attempt was more subtle. Someone poisoned Samuel's well. He discovered it when one of his chickens drank the water and died within an hour. Samuel dumped the well, purified it with lime, and started drawing water from the creek a mile away. He also started testing everything before his family consumed it. The third attempt came in the form of a fire. Someone tried to burn his barn while he slept, but Samuel had been sleeping in the barn for 2 weeks, expecting exactly this, and he caught the arsonist in the act. The man, one of the Klansmen from the final meeting, ran when Samuel confronted him. Samuel didn't pursue. He just made sure the fire was out, then went to Marshal Crawford with the evidence. The arsonist was arrested, questioned, and released the same day. His alibi, provided by 3 other former Klansmen, was ironclad. Samuel learned another lesson about Southern justice. Federal marshals could arrest white men, but local judges would always find ways to let them go. That was when Samuel decided the law wouldn't be enough. He'd given justice a chance. Now it was time for something else. Just when the tension seemed unbearable, when Samuel knew that more attacks were coming and that eventually one would succeed, an opportunity presented itself in an unexpected form. William Hutchins, the man who'd recruited Samuel into the Klan, the man who'd led the attempted attack on Samuel's property, had a routine. Every Wednesday evening, he rode alone to a farm 3 miles outside Hayneville, visiting a widow named Margaret, whose husband had died in the war. The nature of these visits was an open secret. Hutchins had a wife and 4 children at home, but Margaret was young and lonely and poor enough that she couldn't afford to turn away a man with money. Samuel learned this routine through careful observation. He also learned that the road to Margaret's farm passed through a stretch of dense forest where a man could wait unseen for hours. On Wednesday, April 1st, 1885, Hutchins's horse returned to Hayneville without its rider. A search party found Hutchins's body the next morning, lying at the bottom of a ravine 100 yards from the road. His neck was broken. The conclusion was immediate and obvious. The horse had thrown him, he'd fallen down the ravine, and died instantly. Tragic, but not suspicious. No one investigated why a well-trained horse would suddenly bolt. No one examined the narrow tripwire that Samuel had stretched across the road, carefully positioned at exactly the height to catch a horse's front legs. No one questioned why Hutchins had been thrown so precisely toward the ravine rather than simply falling at the roadside. The wire was gone before the search party arrived, dissolved in the creek Samuel used to dispose of evidence. The only marks on the horse's legs could have come from any bramble or branch. And Samuel had been visible in Hayneville that entire evening, playing chess at the Negro church with witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts. The funeral was well attended. Samuel watched from a distance, studying the remaining Klansmen who'd come to pay respects. He memorized their faces, their patterns of movement, their relationships. He was building a catalog, a list of men who needed to learn that terrorism had consequences. 2 weeks later, James Hartford, the banker who'd been released on bond pending trial, drowned in the Alabama River. He'd been fishing alone, something he did every Sunday morning. His body was found 3 miles downstream, caught in tree roots. The official ruling was accidental death, possibly the result of a cramp or sudden illness. What the officials didn't know was that Samuel had spent a week studying the river, learning its currents, identifying places where a man could be swept away, even in relatively calm water. They didn't know about the particular fishing spot Samuel had recommended to Hartford through a mutual acquaintance, casually mentioned as a place where the catfish were biting. They didn't know that Samuel had loosened the bottom of Hartford's rowboat 2 days before, creating a slow leak that would become critical at exactly the wrong moment. Hartford's boat was found overturned. The leak was discovered but attributed to age and poor maintenance. No one suspected murder. because no one imagined that a black man could orchestrate such a precise, patient, methodical killing. The black community of Lowndes County noticed the deaths. They didn't speak about it openly, but information flowed through networks invisible to white observers. People started looking at Samuel differently, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of wary respect. They understood what he was doing. They didn't approve, didn't condemn. They simply watched and waited. By the end of April, 2 more former Klansmen had died. One in a hunting accident. His rifle had malfunctioned, exploding in his hands. The investigation concluded that the weapon had been poorly maintained, the barrel weakened by rust and age. No one examined it closely enough to find the tiny file marks where Samuel had carefully weakened the metal over multiple covert visits to the man's barn. The other death looked like natural causes. Dr. Thomas Warren, not the Klan's Dr. Wortham, but another physician who'd been present at Samuel's whipping, died in his sleep of what appeared to be a heart attack. He was only 42, but heart attacks struck young men sometimes. The symptoms were consistent: chest pain, difficulty breathing, sudden death. What made it perfect was that Dr. Warren had actually been suffering from heart problems. Samuel had learned this by talking to the man's own patients, had studied the doctor's routine, his habits, his weaknesses. The extract of foxglove, deadly in the wrong dose, medicinal in the right one, that Samuel had added to the doctor's evening whiskey had simply accelerated a process already underway. The autopsy showed nothing unusual. Heart failure was heart failure, regardless of its cause. Samuel was becoming what he'd never wanted to be: an instrument of death, operating in shadows, using the same tactics of terror the Klan had perfected. But he felt no guilt. These men had murdered Moses. They'd whipped him. They'd terrorized his community for years. They'd created the rules of this game. Samuel was simply playing it better than they'd ever expected. The 5th death was different. Dr. Charles Wortham, the actual Klan physician who'd been present at multiple atrocities, didn't die by Samuel's hand. He died by his own. The pressure of exposure, of federal investigation, of social ostracism, had broken something in Wortham. His medical practice had evaporated. Former patients wouldn't see him. His wife had left, taking their children to her family in Georgia. Wortham started drinking, then drinking heavily, then not bothering to hide it. On May 3, 1885, he was found dead in his office, an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. The suicide note was brief: "I cannot bear the weight of what I've become." Samuel learned about it at church the following Sunday. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just a kind of cold recognition that guilt could be as effective a weapon as foxglove or weakened rifle barrels. By the time spring turned to summer, 7 former Klansmen were dead. The pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention. All had been present at that final barn meeting. All had been exposed in the newspaper. All had died within 3 months. But proving murder was impossible. Each death had a plausible explanation. Each investigation concluded with accidental or natural causes. And the only person with motive, opportunity, and knowledge was a black farmer whom white authorities refused to see as capable of such sophisticated revenge. Marshal Crawford suspected. Samuel could see it in the way the marshal looked at him during their few interactions. But suspicion wasn't proof. And Crawford was a man who believed in evidence. Without concrete proof, without witnesses, without any clear connection between Samuel and the deaths, Crawford could do nothing. The remaining Klansmen understood, though. They knew what was happening, even if they couldn't prove it. Samuel could see the fear in their eyes when they saw him in town. They crossed to the other side of the street. They avoided him, and slowly, quietly, they started leaving Lowndes County. Pemberton stayed. Pride or stupidity or simple inertia kept him in his failing plantation, watching his world crumble. He hired guards, men who'd fought in the war and weren't afraid of anything. He fortified his mansion, installed new locks, kept weapons in every room. Samuel left him alone, not out of mercy, but out of strategy. Pemberton alive and terrified was more useful than Pemberton dead. He was a reminder, a warning, a living example of what happened when white supremacy met someone who refused to be afraid. Resolution. The trials began in June 1885. 4 Klansmen faced federal charges. Sheriff Tucker, the remaining bank employees who'd been accomplices to Hartford, and 2 men whose participation in specific acts of violence could be proven beyond doubt. The proceedings were held in Montgomery, away from Lowndes County, where federal judges could operate without local pressure. Samuel attended every day, sitting in the colored section of the courtroom, watching justice unfold with patient skepticism. The prosecuting attorney was a young man named Robert Hayes, a northerner who'd come south during Reconstruction and stayed to fight battles most people had already given up on. He presented his case with methodical precision. Testimony from victims, documents from the Klan's own records that Samuel had helped expose, physical evidence of violence. The defense attorneys argued that their clients were good men caught up in troubled times, that the Klan was a fraternal organization misunderstood by Northern aggression, that any violence was the work of rogue elements not representative of the whole. They painted their clients as victims of carpetbaggers, of Negro aggression, of federal overreach. The all-white jury listened to both sides. Samuel watched their faces and saw the conflict. Belief in law versus loyalty to race, evidence versus tribal identity, justice versus the social order they'd grown up defending. The verdicts came in July. Tucker, guilty of conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights. Sentence, 5 years in federal prison. The 2 men charged with specific violence, guilty. Sentences, 7 years each. The bank employees, guilty of lesser charges. Sentences, 2 years. It was simultaneously a victory and a betrayal. Justice had been served, technically. But 5 to 7 years for terrorism, for murder, for years of systematic violence? Samuel knew they'd serve less. Good behavior, appeals, pardons from sympathetic politicians. They'd be free before Daniel finished school. But he also knew it was more than most black victims of white violence ever received. It was acknowledgement, official and recorded, that the Klan had committed crimes. That was something. Not enough, never enough, but something. The men were led away in chains. Tucker looked back as he left the courtroom, his eyes finding Samuel's. There was no hatred in that gaze, only a kind of exhausted recognition. He knew who'd destroyed him. He knew he'd earned it. And he knew there was nothing he could do about it. Pemberton never faced trial. His lawyers filed motion after motion, delaying proceedings, questioning evidence, arguing jurisdictional issues. By the time the prosecution was ready to bring charges, key witnesses had died, disappeared, or recanted their testimony. Without concrete evidence linking Pemberton directly to specific crimes, the case fell apart. Pemberton remained in Lowndes County, but his life was effectively over. His plantation continued its decline. His social standing evaporated. His own family began to distance themselves, embarrassed by the association. He became a ghost haunting his own property, a reminder of a power structure that was crumbling. Samuel saw him occasionally in town, always surrounded by his hired guards. They never spoke. They didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had been said in that tobacco barn. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal, though normal would never be what it had been before. The black community of Lowndes County lived with a new awareness, that resistance was possible, that white terror could be challenged, that sometimes the victims could fight back and win. But they also understood the cost. 7 men were dead, killed in ways that could never be officially acknowledged. Justice had been achieved through methods that mirrored the evil they'd been fighting. Samuel had become a killer, efficient and cold, using the same tactics of terror the Klan had perfected. Clara understood this better than anyone. She'd watched her husband transform from a farmer who just wanted to live in peace into something harder, darker, more dangerous. She'd seen the nightmares that woke him in the middle of the night. She'd heard him whisper names in his sleep, Moses, Hutchins, Hartford, and she'd wondered if the price of their survival had been Samuel's soul. But she never asked. Some questions don't have good answers. Samuel continued farming his 23 acres. He and Clara had 2 more children, daughters born in 1886 and 1888, both healthy, both taught to read from their first years. Daniel grew up strong and smart, inheriting his father's intensity and his mother's wisdom. The land prospered, as much as any land could prosper for a black farmer in Alabama. Always precarious, always one bad harvest, or one vindictive white man away from disaster. The Ku Klux Klan never recovered in Lowndes County. Oh, there were still white supremacists, still violence, still systematic oppression. But the organized terror, the midnight rides, the coordinated campaigns of intimidation, those ended. The exposure had been too complete, the consequences too visible. Other Klavans in other counties continued operating, but in Lowndes County the Klan was finished. Samuel lived quietly for the next 32 years. He never spoke publicly about what he'd done, never confirmed or denied the suspicions that surrounded him. He became known as a successful farmer, a devoted father, a pillar of the colored church. Young people sought his advice. Older people treated him with a respect that went beyond mere social courtesy. He attended Moses's church, rebuilt after the fire stronger than before, every Sunday. He taught farming techniques to younger men, the same lessons Moses had taught him. He helped families buy land, offering advice on dealing with white lawyers and bankers who'd try to cheat them. He became what Moses had been, a leader, a teacher, a source of strength for his community. But there was always something behind his eyes, something that made even his friends slightly uneasy. A coldness, a calculation, a reminder that this gentle farmer who helped his neighbors had once orchestrated 7 deaths with the precision of a military campaign. Pemberton died in 1889, not from violence but from the slow degradation of a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. His plantation was sold for debts, his family scattered. His funeral was poorly attended. Samuel heard about it third hand and felt nothing. The last of the convicted Klansmen left prison in 1892, their sentences reduced for good behavior. Samuel was 40 years old by then, his hair starting to gray, his back occasionally aching from decades of farm work and one particularly brutal whipping. He heard that Tucker had moved to Mississippi, that the others had dispersed across the South, broken men trying to rebuild shattered lives. He wondered sometimes if they'd learned anything. Probably not. Hatred that deep doesn't disappear just because it's punished. But maybe they'd learned to be afraid. Maybe they'd learned that their victims could strike back. That was something. As years passed, the story of what happened in Lowndes County in 1884 and 1885 became legend in the black community. Details shifted with each retelling. Some versions made Samuel more heroic, a righteous avenger striking down evil men. Other versions made him more ruthless, a cold killer who'd lost his humanity in pursuit of revenge. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any story could capture. Samuel's children grew up, went north for education, made lives away from Alabama's suffocating oppression. Daniel became a teacher in Atlanta, carrying on Moses's mission in a city where black children could learn without fear of being burned out. The daughters became nurses, both marrying professional men, both creating families far from the cotton fields their parents had known. Clara aged gracefully, her hair turning white, her hands becoming arthritic, but her mind staying sharp. She and Samuel grew old together, sitting on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs. They didn't talk much about those dark months in 1884 and 1885. Some memories didn't need words. Samuel died on a cool morning in November 1917 at age 65. With Clara holding his hand and Daniel reading from the Bible their mother Ruth had once hidden beneath floorboards. His last words were simple. I did what I had to do. The funeral was massive. Black people came from across Alabama and beyond, paying respects to a man who'd stood up when standing up could get you killed. They understood what he'd done, even if they couldn't speak about it openly. They understood the cost and the necessity and the terrible mathematics of survival in a country that wanted them dead. Clara outlived him by 8 years, dying in 1925 at age 73. At her funeral, an old woman nobody recognized appeared from nowhere, placed a single white camellia on the grave, the flower meaning, "You're a flame in my heart," in the language of the time, and disappeared before anyone could ask her name. Some said it was one of Samuel's daughters, paying tribute in a way their mother would have understood. Others said it was someone whose life had been saved during those months of secret war, someone who'd lived because Samuel had removed her terrorizers. The truth was never discovered, and maybe that was appropriate. Samuel's story had always been one of shadows and secrets, of things done that could never be openly acknowledged, of justice achieved through methods that polite society couldn't condone. The land Samuel fought for remained in the family until 1963, when his grandson, Daniel's son, finally sold it and moved to Chicago during the Great Migration. By then, Alabama was changing, though not fast enough and not far enough. The civil rights movement was gathering strength. New forms of resistance were emerging. Young people were finding ways to fight that didn't require becoming killers. But they stood on foundations laid by people like Samuel, people who'd refused to accept oppression even when resistance seemed impossible, people who'd found ways to fight back using whatever weapons they could access, people who'd survived by becoming dangerous. The records of what happened in Lowndes County exist in fragments scattered across archives. The Mobile Register's exposé from March 1885, preserved on microfilm, federal court documents from the trials, a sealed coroner's report that wasn't opened until 1932, long after everyone involved was dead. The slave registry listing a child named Samuel, born to Ruth in 1852. The land deed in Montgomery showing Samuel Vance as owner of 23 acres, recorded with a precision that suggested someone who understood exactly how important documentation would be. But the complete story of infiltration and manipulation and 7 carefully orchestrated deaths was never officially recorded. It survived in whispers, in stories passed through generations, in the warning that white supremacists in Lowndes County learned. Sometimes the people you terrorize find ways to destroy you. Samuel's great-great-grandchildren live in Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, places their ancestor could barely have imagined. They know the story, or versions of it. They know their ancestor was a man who'd worn a Klan hood and walked among monsters. They know he'd done terrible things for what he believed was justice. They know the line between hero and villain in his story is blurrier than anyone would like. Whether that makes Samuel Vance a hero or something more complicated is a question each generation answers differently. The young tend to see him as a freedom fighter, a man who did what was necessary. The old, who've lived longer with the weight of violence and its consequences, see something more ambiguous, a man who'd been pushed too far, who'd found no other path, who'd saved his community, but lost pieces of himself in the process. What's undeniable is this. For 18 months in 1884 and 1885, a man born into slavery infiltrated the most violent white supremacist organization in Alabama, destroyed it from within using their own tactics of terror and secrecy, and walked away alive to tell no one the full truth of what he'd done. In a time when black lives were legally disposable, when justice was a privilege reserved for white men, when the system was designed to break anyone who resisted, Samuel Vance created his own justice. Imperfect, bloody, morally ambiguous, but undeniably his own. The Ku Klux Klan never recovered in Lowndes County. That simple fact, preserved in historical records, in the absence of organized Klan activity in that county for decades after 1885, stands as Samuel's truest legacy. Not the 7 deaths that were never proven, not the infiltration that was revealed too late to matter, but the simple fact that he'd broken their power in one small corner of Alabama. And sometimes, in the darkest chapters of history, that knowledge, that resistance is possible, that the oppressed can strike back, that terror can be answered with terror is enough. The land Samuel fought for is gone now, developed into suburban housing in the 1970s. The soil that once grew cotton now growing grass in neat squares around ranch houses. But the memory remains, carried by descendants who've scattered across America, who tell their children about an ancestor who refused to bow, who wore a white hood and walked among his enemies, who became what he hated in order to destroy it. History is never as simple as the stories we tell about it. Samuel wasn't purely a hero. The men he killed weren't purely villains, they were products of their time, their culture, their choices, as guilty and as human as anyone. Justice wasn't cleanly served. Evil wasn't clearly defeated. Life continued in its messy, complicated way, carrying scars that never fully healed. But in that complexity, in that moral ambiguity, in that refusal to fit into neat categories of right and wrong, Samuel's story tells us something important about survival, about resistance, about the terrible choices people make when they're pushed beyond endurance. He lived, he fought, he won, in ways that cost him everything and gave him everything. And that perhaps is all anyone can do when caught in history's machinery, when the only choices are submission or transformation into something you never wanted to become. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Samuel's actions were justified, or did his methods make him as evil as the men he destroyed? The line between justice and revenge, between survival and murder, between hero and killer, has always been thinner than we'd like to admit. History is full of people who had to make impossible choices, who became dark things to fight darker things. Samuel Vance was one of them, a man who infiltrated hell and came back changed forever. Leave your comment below with your thoughts on this complicated legacy. If you found this story as haunting as I did uncovering it, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We tell the stories history tried to bury, the ones that don't fit into comfortable narratives, the ones that force us to think about what we do in impossible situations. Share this video with someone who appreciates difficult truths and moral complexity. Until the next story, remember, the past is never as simple as it seems, and sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we create when we're trying to survive.